The GPS DairyCAST features the high-value insights of the GPS Dairy Consulting team's trusted advisors and the owners and managers from the elite dairy farms they serve. These conversations deliver on the GPS Dairy Consulting promise to inspire change and grow leaders.
Hello and welcome to the GPS DairyCAST. I'm Peggy Coffeen from the Up-Level Dairy Podcast, serving as your host. And on this GPS DairyCAST, we are coming to you from the 2024 GPS Leaders Forum. And joining me for this episode is GPS team member Marty Faldet, and one of our featured speakers from this year's conference, Kevin Harvatine from Penn State University. And he's going to be talking about maximizing milk fat yield. In this episode, you're going to hear about the seasonal rhythms of milk fat depression, finding the sweet spot between milk production and components, and corrective action for incremental milk fat gains. Enjoy this conversation with Marty and Kevin.
Kevin, what a great topic, maximizing milk fat yield with what we have going on today on farms and needing to generate more revenue. And milk fat you can influence a little bit better maybe than milk protein. So to me, really excites me. It's something I feel like I can help improve or change. Hopefully always in a good way versus bad. But can you kind of summarize what you talked about today?
Yeah, well, just starting out, like the reason I like working in milk fats, exactly some things you hit on. There's economic importance to it. We can change it. And we've learned a lot about what happens when we are changing it, right? So it's really neat that we like to do experiments where we can understand the biology of what's going on. We can know it's repeatable. And we can go out and tell someone, hey, you can do this and have an impact on your bottom line. My goal in the work we do is to be able to go out and say you look at a farm, you look at a cow, to really understand, okay, she's making this amount of milk fat. Why is she doing that? So I like to look at it as nutritional and non-nutritional factors. So first thing we have to understand is cows are going to differ. Part of that's genetics, stage of lactation. We have to take all that into account. But then there's also the nutritional side, right? And that's where
that's where I get a little more excited about, right?
Yeah, me too, because I always say I have a short attention span. So I want to do something today that's going to have an effect tomorrow. Genetics, there's a big influence there. And that's been happening that we see over a 10-year span, right? I mean, that's on a linear effect that every year we're going up. But I want to be able to have an effect tomorrow. So we can do that with nutrition, and that to me is really exciting.
Well, the genetic thing, you just mentioned it, and I think you had the table of genetic progress and how it pretty much just took off in terms of its influence on higher percent fat in the milk. Yeah. And that just stunned me because I feel it out in the farms that have more genetics. You can definitely feel they have a couple tenths more fat tests. It's easier to get if that makes sense. But I didn't realize it was that significant.
I'm not a geneticist, so I'll probably get some of these details wrong. But in the big view of it, if we look at since, say, 1960s, we've been increasing in pounds of fat yield, but we're driving that through pounds of milk yield, not changing milk fat percent, right? So we're stuck at that yearly average is at 375 over decades, right? But then about 10 years ago, part of this is genomic selection and the equations they build that I think are more being used today than before genomic selection, right? So they're still selecting on pounds of fat and pounds of protein, but they started putting a negative in for lactose. So then what that does is it's putting some pressure on to gain fat pounds, not just through milk yield, because we are still gaining milk flow, but it's putting pressure on value of an increase in fat percent. So I really like looking at our milk market averages, and we're again at 375 for many years. The Northeast milk market this past year, our 12-month average was touching on a 4.2.
Oh, that's crazy.
That's crazy in 10 years to go from that 375 to a 4.2. Now, we always like to say, why is that? And again, in this trouble with some nutritionists that I don't want to take all the credit for that. I mean, I think nutrition management, we deserve some of the credit for that, but we can't overlook that the genomic selection and the genetic pressure in those equations is really changing the cow that we have. Now, I think we have to keep up to that cow, And we can certainly screw that cow up if we have milk fat depression. I think we can limit her potential if we're not feeding her well. At least in academia, we usually are in turf warfares of the geneticist versus the nutritionist. We don't need that. We can both work together. We can get the advantage of both pieces.
Yeah, you mentioned milk fat depression. In my earlier years, that was a common conversation because acidosis always was the buzzword around that, and it just feels like that's not even in a conversation typically anymore, just because how we can both balance diets and manage that feed being dropped. But what would be considered milk fat depression, or what's your research around in this area?
So that's always the big question of when do I have milk fat depression? So I said it was my first love in research was milk fat depression. In the last couple of years, I've run into a lot of people that say, oh, we don't have milk fat depression anymore. And it's like, oh, I thought this was something I could research for my entire life.
Right.
Did we solve the problem? And what I've been challenging people is that I think we still have more occurrence of milk fat depression that we're missing, right?
But is it associated with acidosis per se, or?
Well, so I think we are getting a lot better on some of the classic things. So if you look at, we have a lot less high moisture corn. Well, we're feeding a lot more high corn silage diets. So that high moisture corn is in our corn silage. It's not in the
Kevin, one of the things, I'm just going to bring this up because it is a pet peeve of mine. I am not a proponent of high moisture corn. I do not like it in a diet. If we're talking about high value fat in a milk, you are going to lose some milk fat. I'm just like, it doesn't matter what you tell me. I'm telling you, you will lose milk fat. You might not see it, but it's lost.
Yeah, no, I think high moisture corn is just really hard to manage, right? Yeah. And there are times that farms are using it because it's the economical way for them to do it. But I don't know many nutritionists that like
feeding
high moisture corn.
But I agree, we do feed higher corn silage, so you're trading some of that around. So
that's why I often laughed about it, because we don't have as much high moisture corn, but then we have such higher corn silage diets that we're just storing it. But it's an easier way to manage that. And if you think about the better jobs we're doing with corn silage processing,
absolutely,
like it's a good way to feed. It's a better way to feed the high moisture corn. So coming back to that milk fat depression issue, what I think is happening, if we think back to when milk fat was average 375, when did you diagnose milk fat depression? Well, if that herd hit 3.4, your phone probably was ringing that we have a problem here, we better fix this, right? Now, if we are averaging a 4.2 across the year, I also like to talk about that seasonal rhythm. We spent some time characterizing that. Rhythm right now from January to July is probably about 0.25, 0.3 units different, right? So if we're going to average a 4...
So the low,
so from low to the high. So if we're going to average a 4.2, and if we're going to January, we should be about 0.15 above that. So we should be a 4.35, right? So let's go back 3.75 to a 4.3, the alarm bells were going off. If we should be at a 4.35, if we're at a 4.0, the alarm bells should be going off, right?
I would agree that under 4 is like, it should be under 4, but there'll be times you kind of dip a little bit, but it's like 4+ is the summer low now,
Yeah, but the thing is, can you get really worried about a 3.95, right? So I think part of it is, to me at least, the resetting that the levels that we should be expecting is really hard, and it's harder to be upset with the 3.95 or as worried about it as you were at a 3.4. So I've been really encouraging people is, look, we need to be setting our goals and evaluating those as accurately and precisely as we can. Because I don't think we have as much of an occurrence as milk fat depression today as what we did 15 years ago when we had all this distillers coming out of new plants that were really variable and really high fat.
Exactly.
We were not as good at feed management. I think we're feeding higher forage diets today. We're better at mixing and delivering that feed. A lot of things. And you go back to the genetics part. The geneticist doesn't know what they are selecting for. They definitely are selecting for cows that are more resistant to milk fat depression. Just how they eat, how their rumen works.
Yep.
I'm sure we have less, but I think we still are misdiagnosing or missing out on some of that. And
In terms of like maximizing the potential of fat yield, you're saying?
Yeah. And my argument would be if we've totally got out of all milk fat depression, we are losing milk yield, right? So if you think about that risk of milk fat depression is you're increasing diet fermentability. And you need to do that to get microbial protein and energy intake, right? So if we're playing it that safe, that we have zero occurrence of milk fat depression, we're losing out on something else. And that's if we're trying to maximize microbial protein, maximize energy intake in that cow, we can't do that with zero risk for milk fat depression. Now, again, I think we are less than what we were years before.
You probably have better tools to address it sooner.
Yeah, I think we know a lot more about it. We stay away from the risk factors. We've reduced some of those risk factors.
We probably got information and data coming at us more often, like we got instant component information. All of us as consultants can tap into that pretty fast. Yeah. It's documented, so we can already tell if something's slipping on us.
You're getting a lot more data back from creameries on a much more frequent basis. What I've really been encouraging people to do is sit down once a year, take your calendar, and write on each month what you want your milk components to be, right? And I think that can really help take some of the emotion out of it and set those accurate and precise goals. I mean, we know there's this seasonal rhythm. I don't know how to manage out of that, but we can at least right now be setting expectations on both sides, because I think sometimes we're chasing ghosts during the summer because we're lower than what we were in January. Well, we are going to be. That's just how the cow works. But we're probably also at times losing potential in January because that cow could be doing better, but we don't realize that. So that in two parts of that, you can program in, based on what the new potential of this cow is and that seasonal rhythm, we can accurately, precisely set those goals. And then we can know if we have milk fat depression a little bit better.
Yeah, a couple comments. I'm hopefully can remember them here, but one of them had to do with the data on genetic. I think you had something about genetic ability for milk fat production across farms. And it was pretty uniform. If I remember seeing that, I'm like,
it's crazy uniform. So we've done this twice. We've pulled the data from DRMS, so that's the DHA, one of the DHA databases. So you have just under 6,000 herds, and looked at their PTA for milk fat, average PTA in their herds. And when you convert it to put it on milk fat percent, the 10th and 90th percentiles, like 0.05 percentage units, like hardly any variation between herds. Now, I have kind of mixed feelings on this because I think there's so much information in the computer in coming off farms that we're not using, right? So I hate to tell people, don't go look at your farm's genetic potential, because that data's there and it's free, especially even if you're just capturing sire codes. With sire and maternal grandsire, you can get 75% of your predicted genetic potential, right? So we have that data available. We should be looking at that in knowing what the genetic potential of our herd is. But likely, your potential is pretty similar to everybody else's. It seems that part of it's probably that the sires we're using are really the sires that the bull studs picked to bring in. So we're kind of all being pulled by that industry selection.
Yeah, the couple herds that I always have said, they complimented me on how high the components are, and I'm like, I'm doing the same as what we do on other farms. In their genetic, they do have a lot of good genetics, and they just seem they're always 0.2 higher. If it's a 100-pound on average herd, they'll be up to 4.6, 4.7 in the winter. Maybe drop to a 4.1, 4.2 type of thing in the summer type of concept. Once that always impressed me, I guess. Yeah.
The GPS Dairy Consulting team is growing and is looking for people that can be a part of the journey. A successful GPS Dairy Consultant is someone that is self-driven and loves to learn. It's an individual with a progressive mindset and one that is very entrepreneurial. Most importantly, GPS Dairy Consultants believe in teamwork and supporting one another. Does this sound like you? Collaboration is the business's horsepower, and it's the reason behind the success of our consultants. To learn more about joining GPS Dairy Consulting, LLC, talk to any GPS consultant. Visit gpsdairy.com or email our team directly to contact@gpsdairy.com.
It's good to look at that information. What I'd say is I run into some places that people use as an excuse. They say, well, I've always had low milk fat, right?
That's where I was going at right there.
Yeah, so they say, I've always had low milk fat. It's just our cows. It's like, well, you've always managed your cows the way you've managed them, right? So I think that's a really good conversation to have. Is it the cows or is it the management scenario that we're doing that database would say most people are pretty similar.
Must be the high moisture corn. No, I'm just kidding. No, one of the things that on the milk fat depression you mentioned being in that sweet spot, right, of being able to maximize. You can have both. You can have your cake and your topping, ice cream, whatever you want to say, or you can have the milk and the components. I truly believe that. I do agree with that point where you're trying to push the animal to a point and you're not wanting to tip that rumen functioning process. And so there is times in the past where it seemed like I would be in a situation or would start working with the herd and the herd had milk fat depression and you had to tip it back. And it seemed like it took a lot more effort to tip it back. Either that or I wasn't patient enough. And then you can unwind some of the things you did that maybe added more cost to the diet. So are there certain things that work for addressing milk fat depression outside of management?
Yeah, so what I think often happens why it's hard to fix milk fat depression on farms is when it's in the forages, right? And then you don't have a lot of options. So you have to pick on high moisture corn again. If you have a big inventory of high moisture corn,
that would be
especially
dilution is usually somewhat of a solution if you can, but
but your hands are often tied in those, right? And I think we will get into certain crop years or situations like that where there's a forage issue that you have to work around, and then that's going to be more difficult. The other thing is that we usually like to blame milk fat depression on one thing, and that's usually the last thing we added to the diet. But I always say that's the straw that broke the camel's back, but it's not the only culprit. So we always like to talk about risk factors, and your diet is a certain risk that is the combination and the interactions of all those individual risk factors. So I think it's worth in those scenarios to step back and say, okay, what risk factors can I pull out and how can I rework this? For many years, everything that we did on milk fat depression was things that increased risk for milk fat depression. And that really frustrated people in the industry because they're like, well, you're telling me what not to do, but what can I do?
Oh, good point.
And so one of the things that we did a series of experiments on was HMTBA, so Aliment was the product that we worked with, so the methionine analog. In our experiments, there's very consistent. So we set up scenarios where we are increasing risk by adding more starch and adding unsaturated fat. And in that series of, I forget, it was 4 or 5 experiments, as we increase risk for milk fat depression, Aliment would reduce that. Basically, in that milk fat depression, you have that switch in the rumen that's shifting to making those bioactives that cause milk fat depression. So Aliment inhibited that. So exactly why it does it, we don't know. What we're able to see is in the bacteria microbiome side, you increase protozoa, you maintain a more diverse rumen microbiome. So it's doing something in the rumen is I think, a rumen modifier. So that's one place where I think there's something you can specifically add to reduce that risk. We have a lot of historical data on buffers in increasing DCAD. It benefits fiber digestibility, we know it increases milk yield, and I think that's through decreasing milk fat depression. There's a lot of other products out there that I think have mechanisms that you would expect to be beneficial. The experiments haven't been done to directly say that they're reducing milk fat depression, but if you think about any of the products have a mechanism where they're going to help the rumen, stabilize the rumen, increase microbial diversity. There's potential for them. I don't think every one of them is going to work in every scenario. That's where you have to
It's not like they're all additive. If you add all four, you're going to get this miraculous, response or something.
Yeah. So, and I think you probably would want to look to see, put it in, is it working for me or not? That's one of the first experiments we did when I started on faculty, was looking at the time course of milk fat depression, induction and recovery. And when you cause a problem, it's a progressive decrease over 7 to 10 days. And basically by 14 days, you have complete milk fat depression. You fix the problem, and same thing, progressive increase, and it takes 14, 18 days, and you're back to where you are. So I always say, when you have a problem and you're trying to fix things, you don't need to wait 2 months, right? You make that change over 7 to 14 days. You should be seeing things move in the right direction.
Yeah, I like that kind of data to really ground you in saying, okay, we need 2 weeks to assess where we're at after we made that change or additive addition or whatever that is.
And the reality is, usually those changes are going to be incremental, right? I can give you a diet that has zero risk for milk fat depression. You're just not going to make much milk on that diet, right? So when you're trying to make those adjustments, usually you want to make small adjustments, watch to where things are moving, just because you don't want to lose milk. You don't want to drastically increase your feed cost, right?
Yeah, one of the things we haven't touched too much on at all has to do with more of the fatty acid profile of adding fats, the whole palmit. I say it's a craze, but I'm not meaning like it's going to go away type of thing. It's truly a part of diets these days. What's their comments around?
So on the nutrition side, I think of it as you can decrease milk fat through milk fat depression, and you can increase milk fat a little bit, not as much as you can decrease it, but you can increase it a little bit by adding more of what the cow needs to make milk fat. So about 55% of the fat that she's making, she's getting from the diet. She's absorbing that fat, putting it into milk. The other 45% she's making from scratch. And to do that, she needs a lot of acetate. So I'll quickly comment on that. We did a series of experiments looking at providing additional acetate in the diet, and we can see responses to increasing acetate. Now you cannot.
So is that like digestible fibers, stuff like that?
So that's saying we were adding sodium acetate as an experimental approach to demonstrate you can't afford to buy sodium acetate.
Correct.
So the rumen is making acetate through digestible starch and fiber. You are getting, as a proportion, more acetate from fiber, but any fermentation of the rumen under stable conditions, you're getting more acetate. So that's the story. That's hard work to get better quality forages, better rumen function, right? But I think that's where you mentioned these herds that are just above other people. How are they doing that? I think they're doing it through better fiber digestibility, rumen function, cow comfort, all those things that really are hard to pull off together.
Right.
But I think that's how those herds are getting that additional increment of milk fat. Now on the fat supplement side, we've done quite a bit of fat supplement work. The way I like to think about dietary fat is you have your basal fat coming in from your corn silage. Yep. And I do think it's worth every year getting corn silage fatty acid profile by NIR, just to know where you are, because there's some variation there, and that changes your risk for milk fat depression. I like bringing in economical sources. What I call economical sources first. Oil seeds commonly are that category. And of course, there's a lot of interest around high oleic soybeans now. And then the next part is your dry fat supplements. So palmitic acid will give you a more consistent response in milk fat. That's really nice data out there. Part of that response to the fat supplement depends where you're starting at. So if you're starting at a low dietary fat, we have a couple experiments where adding a fat that's a blend of palmitic and stearic, we can get a pretty nice fat response because we're starting low, right? Now, if you have some oil seeds in that diet already, Now you're bringing in that fat supplement, you're going to see more response to palmitic than in a blend there. Why does palmitic do that? We've been trying to figure that out. I don't have a good answer. I think it is a little bit higher transfer into the mammary gland, has, I think, a little bit less of we get the substitution effect that if you're feeding fat, the cow uses that fat rather than making fat through that de novo synthesis. So I think it has a little bit less of a feedback.
The sparing effect of the de novo side.
Yeah. So I think it's a combination of things, but it's really interesting that fat isn't just energy. They're not all the same, right? They're having some differential effects there.
I'm always struggling with the amount of fat in a diet to influence not only milk fat, but it's the whole outproduction condition on a cow, reproductive performance, some of those things. And so you did show some of, I think, data where going too far, actually, you go backwards on the cow having the de novo synthesis or the natural forming of fatty acids, so you probably go backwards a little bit?
Yeah, so we've done a couple experiments where we're trying to figure out, so we can't say that there's a essential requirement for amount of fat, right? Because the cow can make fat herself, but we're trying to figure out, can we come up with a feeding recommendation? We've really failed at this, so we did a couple dose titrations. And I will say, I think we're feeding lower fat diets today than what we're used to.
Absolutely.
And part of that was we got burned so many times with bad distiller grains, and we figured out if we could reduce dietary fat, unsaturated fat, we'd reduce our risk for milk fat depression. And then actually, early part of the pandemic, fat became so expensive or impossible to get.
Right.
So we were trying to think through that. What happens when we reduce dietary fat? And we have some experiments where we can titrate down dietary fat and milk fat yield doesn't change, right? We have other experiments where when we titrate down dietary fat, we start losing milk fat yield. And I think what it is that cow will compensate with de novo synthesis if she can, which means she needs the acetate to do that. If she doesn't have good forages, good rumen function, she can't compensate to de novo. She runs out of capacity there. So that's where I don't think we can have, and I can't give you an exact number, but I do think we need a certain level of fat to maintain milk fat yield, but also, like you said, body condition score, reproductive function, but we don't have the number there. The big thing I would say is watch your cows, right? And the cows are going to tell you both, not just through production, but also repro body condition score.
That's why we need part 2. We need to come up with those numbers. I realize we're running out of time and would love to keep talking about milk fat, maximizing milk fat because of the dollars around that. I mean, if it's over $3 a pound, you got a 100-pound herd, that's 1/10 is 30 cents. It's pretty easy math. I appreciate all the information you provided.
No, thank you.
You just heard from GPS team member Marty Faldet as well as Kevin Harvatine from Penn State University on this GPS DairyCast. I'm your host, Peggy Coffeen from the Uplevel Dairy Podcast, and thanks for listening to the GPS DairyCast.
The GPS DairyCast features conversations that deliver on the GPS Dairy Consulting promise to inspire change and grow leaders. If this GPS DairyCast has you looking for more ways to become an elite dairy producer, find more information in our show notes on how you can add a GPS advisor to your team.